When Emily Carter first stepped onto the naval base, she carried nothing but a slim leather folder under her arm and the lingering reminder from her supervisor that she was just an assistant. The words echoed in her mind even as she straightened her uniform blouse and adjusted the badge clipped neatly to her pocket. She had been hired as a civilian aide to the logistics division, tasked with schedules, communication records, and the endless flood of paperwork that no officer seemed to want to touch. She had learned quickly that she blended into the background. People passed her in the hallway with curt nods or sometimes no acknowledgement at all, and when the commanding officers discussed strategy, she was usually told to wait outside. Yet Emily's eyes absorbed everything. She noted the rhythms of the base, the way reports arrived late at night from teams deployed overseas, the quiet tension whenever the SEAL units returned from missions, and the hushed conversations between commanders who never noticed that the quiet assistant in the corner remembered every word. What they never suspected was that Emily had grown up in a military family. Her father had been a decorated Marine who taught her discipline from childhood, and her older brother had been a SEAL candidate until an injury forced him out. She had dreamed of service herself, but medical restrictions and family expectations pushed her into support roles. To the officers here she was invisible, a background figure meant to type, print, and fetch coffee. But Emily had carried her father's stories all her life. She knew more about battlefield logistics than some lieutenants, and she had a sharp instinct for patterns and data that most people ignored. The first weeks passed without incident, until the day a coded message arrived from overseas. Emily had been the one to transcribe the raw data as it filtered in through the secure line. While the official on duty yawned and scribbled his signature on the intake form, she noticed something odd buried in the coordinates. Numbers repeated in a sequence she recognized from her father's old tactical notes, a kind of cipher once used in the Marines for emergency extractions. She hesitated, staring at the sheet, her pulse quickening. When she tried to raise the issue with the communications officer, he brushed her off with a laugh, telling her she was reading too much into routine chatter. But that night she couldn't shake the feeling that a SEAL team out in hostile territory had sent a disguised call for help, and if nobody acted, men could die. Emily stayed late, cross-referencing the signal against archived patterns. Hours slipped away as she pieced together fragments until she was certain. It was a distress code, cleverly hidden to slip past enemy interceptors. She typed up a report and placed it on the duty officer's desk, but by morning it had been tossed aside, marked with a dismissive note, "Assistant speculation, ignore." The rejection stung, yet her determination burned hotter. She couldn't let it go. 2 days later, she overheard fragments of conversation in the hallway, a SEAL unit overdue, a commander frustrated with the lack of intel. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched her folder, knowing the code she had seen was the missing link. She tried again, cornering a mid-ranking officer after a briefing. He barely concealed his irritation as he reminded her she had no clearance to make operational suggestions. "You're here to file, Carter, not to analyze," he snapped, walking away without a second glance. Humiliation scorched her, but beneath it rose anger. She spent that night alone in the records office, running silent calculations, mapping potential extraction routes based on the hidden coordinates. It wasn't recklessness driving her, but the memory of her father telling her that service meant responsibility, even when no one recognized your role. And so, when dawn crept across the base, Emily carried her findings straight to the office of the SEAL commander himself, Captain Marcus Hale. Hale was a man feared for his intensity, broad-shouldered and battle-worn, with eyes that carried the weight of too many missions. Emily expected to be thrown out the moment she stammered that she had information regarding the missing team. But instead of dismissing her outright, he leaned back in his chair, arms folded, watching her closely as she laid out the coded message, the repeating pattern, and the extraction routes she had mapped. She spoke quickly, heart racing, but with clarity born from sleepless nights. When she finished, the room was silent. Hale's gaze didn't waver. Finally, he picked up the report she had typed and read it line by line. Minutes passed, stretching her nerves taut. Then, without a word, he reached for the secure phone and began issuing orders to verify her analysis. Emily stood frozen, half expecting to be reprimanded, but the commander's tone carried urgency and trust. Within hours, helicopters roared into the sky on a redirected course. Later, when the news came back that the SEAL team had indeed been stranded near the very coordinates she had identified, the base buzzed with astonishment. Hale sought her out personally, his face unreadable, before giving her a single nod that said more than words. For the first time, Emily felt the invisible weight of being acknowledged. She thought that would be the end, a fleeting recognition before returning to her quiet desk. But in the following days Hale began calling her into meetings, asking for her observations during debriefings, even handing her raw data before anyone else had seen it. Some officers grumbled, but Hale silenced them with a glare. To him, Emily was no longer just an assistant. She had saved lives with her insight, and though she carried no stripes on her sleeve, he treated her like someone who had earned respect. The whispers spread quickly through the base, but Emily stayed focused, determined not to let pride distract her. She simply did her work, listened, and when necessary, spoke with the same calm conviction that had carried her before Hale's desk. And then came the moment that would change everything, the one she would never forget. The SEALs she had helped rescue returned to base, bruised and weary but alive. As they disembarked, lined in formation, Captain Hale stepped forward to welcome them. And before the gathered ranks of soldiers and officers, he turned to Emily. Silence swept the air as the hardened commander of SEALs brought his hand up in a crisp salute, directed not at a decorated officer, but at the young civilian assistant who had refused to be invisible. Emily's throat tightened, her vision blurred, and though protocol dictated she couldn't return the salute, her heart answered with a pride deeper than anything she had ever known. The salute changed everything for Emily. Overnight, the woman who had once been overlooked as a background figure became the subject of hushed conversations and sideways glances in the mess hall. Some admired her, others resented her sudden elevation. Yet Emily kept her composure, aware that the spotlight could vanish as quickly as it had appeared. Captain Hale, however, made no effort to hide his acknowledgement of her. He invited her to observe strategic discussions, even when senior officers grumbled about the presence of a civilian aide. When one colonel protested that her input carried no authority, Hale replied with a curt firmness that silenced the room, "Authority didn't save our men. Her insight did." From then on she was no longer dismissed during meetings, though the resentment lingered in the air like static. Emily felt the tension every time she entered the command center, yet she also carried a quiet satisfaction. For the first time she wasn't invisible. Still she remained cautious, careful not to overstep. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did offer an observation, it was precise, rooted in data, and often confirmed by outcomes in the field. Slowly, grudgingly, others began to realize that this so-called assistant had an eye for detail and a calmness under pressure that many commissioned officers lacked. Her role grew heavier when another crisis unfolded. A reconnaissance drone returned scrambled images of an enemy compound deep in mountainous terrain. The analysts debated for hours, unable to agree whether it housed high-value targets or decoys. Hale handed the file to Emily without hesitation. She studied the blurred patterns long into the night, comparing them against archived satellite sweeps and noting the unusual consistency of vehicle tracks leading in and out of the site. To most eyes the tracks were meaningless, but Emily recognized the supply rhythms, trucks arriving at intervals that suggested fuel and ammunition replenishment. It wasn't a decoy, it was an active stronghold. When she presented her analysis to the commanders the next morning, skepticism filled the room until Hale intervened. He ordered a limited strike team based on her conclusion, and within 48 hours they confirmed the capture of crucial enemy operatives. The victory spread across the base like wildfire, and though the official reports credited the intelligence division, the SEALs who carried out the mission knew the truth. Emily saw it in their eyes when they passed her in the corridor, a subtle nod of acknowledgement that meant more to her than any medal. Despite these successes, not everyone celebrated her presence. A few officers, threatened by her growing influence, began whisper campaigns that she was overstepping boundaries, undermining the chain of command, even risking classified leaks. One particularly vocal major cornered her outside the communications wing, sneering that she was a glorified secretary who had gotten lucky twice. Emily swallowed her anger and responded with calm dignity, reminding him that the only thing that mattered was whether lives were saved. She walked away before he could reply, but the sting of his words stayed with her. Later that evening, Hale found her still working at her desk long after most had gone. He didn't offer sympathy, instead he simply placed a fresh file in front of her and said, "We need your eyes on this." It was his way of telling her she mattered, that no whisper could undo the reality of what she contributed. Emily felt a steadying warmth in her chest. She wasn't here to win popularity, she was here to serve, even if the world insisted on underestimating her. The weeks blurred into a relentless rhythm of coded messages, mission briefings, and tense nights when helicopters thundered into the sky while she waited with clenched hands, praying the SEALs would return. Each success deepened her bond with the team, though she rarely interacted with them directly. They were warriors hardened by fire, while she remained the quiet figure at the periphery, guiding from the shadows. Yet there were moments, fleeting but powerful, when their worlds intersected. Once, after a grueling mission, one SEAL approached her in the corridor, his uniform still dusty from the field. He didn't speak, simply touched 2 fingers to his brow in a half-salute before walking past. Emily stood frozen, the gesture burning into her memory. She understood then that respect was not always loud. Sometimes it was the silent acknowledgement from those who risked everything. As her responsibilities grew, so did the weight of secrecy. She carried knowledge she could never share outside the base. Coordinates of hidden operations, intercepted transmissions, names of captured operatives. It isolated her, creating a distance even with her family. When her mother called, asking why she always sounded tired, Emily forced a cheerful tone, hiding the truth of sleepless nights spent decoding signals that could mean life or death. She wondered sometimes if this burden was why few civilians ever lasted long in military support roles. Yet each time she considered stepping back, she remembered the salute Hale had given her, the moment he had seen her not as an assistant but as someone essential. That memory anchored her through the hardest nights. Then came the operation that tested her like never before. A sudden surge of intercepted chatter suggested an ambush planned against one of the SEAL teams preparing for deployment. The intelligence was fragmented, riddled with false leads, and the analysts were split down the middle. Some insisted it was enemy disinformation, others believed it pointed to real danger. Hale called for Emily, his tone sharper than usual, urgency written in his face. He asked her directly, "Do we pull them back or do we go?" The weight of that question nearly crushed her. She wasn't a commander, she had no authority to make such calls. And yet Hale trusted her judgment more than the trained analysts. Emily pored over the transcripts, tracing the threads of conversation, listening to the pauses and subtle shifts in code. Finally she saw it, a repeated phrase buried in the chatter that mirrored the distress cipher she had once identified. It wasn't a bluff. It was a trap. With a steady breath, she looked Hale in the eye and said, "If they go in as planned, they won't come back." Hale held her gaze for a long, charged silence. Then he issued the abort order. Hours later, confirmation arrived. The ambush had been real, deadly, and waiting. The SEAL team, redirected at the last moment, avoided catastrophe. Word spread quickly, and though Emily expected more backlash from the officers who doubted her, none came. The results spoke louder than any argument. That night, as she sat alone in the dim glow of her desk lamp, she realized how far she had come from the day she first walked onto the base, dismissed as invisible. She was no longer just an assistant. She had become a lifeline, unseen but indispensable, carrying the weight of lives on her shoulders with quiet strength. And deep down, though she never sought glory, she knew one thing with certainty. The salute Hale had given her was not the last she would earn. The base began to feel different after the ambush was averted. Emily noticed the change first in the way conversations paused when she entered a room, then resumed with a sharper edge of respect. The SEALs who once barely registered her presence now greeted her with nods, and sometimes a quiet word of thanks passed from their lips. It was subtle but unmistakable. The officers who had mocked her before avoided direct confrontation, though she could sense their resentment simmering beneath the surface. Yet Captain Hale's unwavering support acted as a shield. His presence silenced critics before they spoke, and the weight of his authority protected her from the sharp edges of military politics. Still, Emily was not naive. She knew envy could fester in silence, and she stayed vigilant, determined to prove herself not just once or twice, but every time lives hung in the balance. The next challenge arrived under a veil of secrecy. A transport convoy carrying classified equipment went dark in hostile territory. Official reports suggested mechanical failure, but the timing seemed too precise, too coincidental. Hale handed Emily the preliminary data without explanation, trusting her to find what others might miss. She studied the logs until her eyes ached, noticing inconsistencies in the convoy's communication records. A transmission had been cut mid-sentence, yet no alarm had been raised by the monitoring team. She dug deeper, comparing it with intercepted enemy chatter. Slowly, a picture formed. The convoy hadn't simply broken down, it had been hijacked, and someone within their own ranks had tampered with the signals to cover it. When she presented her findings to Hale, he didn't question her once. He simply leaned forward, eyes sharp, and asked, "Who?" Emily hesitated, knowing the implication. Pointing to sabotage within their own base was dangerous, but the evidence was clear. She traced the falsified signatures back to a single technician in the communications division. Hale ordered a discreet investigation, and within days the truth emerged. A mole had been feeding intel to the enemy for months. The capture of the traitor shook the base to its core, and for many, it was the final confirmation that Emily Carter's instincts were not luck but a gift. Her life became a blur of responsibility after that. She worked tirelessly, often sleeping only in brief snatches at her desk. Hale occasionally ordered her to rest, but he also knew she thrived under pressure. The SEALs began dropping by her office unannounced, sometimes to deliver raw data directly, sometimes just to sit for a moment in the presence of the woman who had saved them. Emily found it strange at first, these hardened men of war, whose lives were built on discipline and violence, showing quiet gratitude in their own reserved way. One left a folded patch from his uniform on her desk with no note. Another placed a single coin engraved with the team insignia in her hand before walking away without a word. Each gesture humbled her, grounding her even more firmly in her purpose. She didn't wear medals, but she carried their respect like armor. Yet the more valuable she became, the more dangerous her position grew. One night as she left the base late, headlights flared in the darkness. A black vehicle idled at the far end of the lot, engine humming. For a moment she thought it was nothing, but her instincts screamed otherwise. She hurried back inside, reporting the incident to security. The next day Hale confronted her with grim news. Enemy operatives were aware of her role. She had become a target. The realization struck hard. She had always assumed her invisibility was her shield, but now her very visibility was a liability. Hale ordered extra security for her, though Emily resisted at first, unwilling to accept that her work had put others at risk. Hale silenced her objections with a firm statement. "You've saved too many lives for us to gamble yours." She understood then that her world had shifted irrevocably. She was no longer a shadow behind the scenes but a figure enemies feared enough to eliminate. Despite the danger, Emily refused to back down. Her resolve only deepened when intelligence revealed a looming threat, a coordinated assault planned against one of the Allied embassies overseas. The chatter was fragmented, buried under layers of misdirection, but she pieced it together with painstaking patience. What chilled her was not just the plan itself, but the speed of its execution. If they didn't act swiftly, hundreds of lives could be lost. Hale placed the burden squarely on her shoulders, asking her to pinpoint the location and timing. Emily worked without rest, fueled by adrenaline and the memory of every salute, every life that depended on her. She traced the supply movements, analyzed weather patterns, and mapped enemy logistics until at last the threads aligned. She presented her conclusion with steady clarity. The attack would strike at dawn in a city across the border, masked as a civilian protest. Hale acted immediately, mobilizing forces to intercept. When the dust settled, the assault had been thwarted before it began, and the embassy staff evacuated safely. The reports credited intelligence divisions as always, but those who knew the truth spread word quietly through the ranks. Emily Carter had stopped a massacre. The weight of that victory was almost too much to bear. Emily spent the night alone, trembling with exhaustion and relief. She had never fired a weapon, never stepped onto a battlefield, yet she had fought wars with her mind and carried scars no one could see. In the silence of her quarters, she wondered if she had chosen this path or if it had chosen her. She had once been dismissed as just an assistant, a figure in the background. Now she was something else entirely, a hidden cornerstone in operations that shaped the tide of battles. And though she longed for the simplicity of anonymity, she knew that chapter of her life was gone. The salute Hale had given her was not a token gesture but a promise, a recognition of what she had become. And as the night deepened, Emily realized that her journey was only beginning, and the battles ahead would demand more of her than she had ever imagined. The embassy attack marked a turning point for Emily. From that day forward, she was no longer seen merely as a fortunate aide with sharp instincts but as a vital part of the operational heartbeat of the base. The trust Hale placed in her had now become unshakable, and with every passing week, the lines between civilian and soldier blurred. She still wore no rank, yet officers twice her senior deferred to her analysis when Hale called for her perspective. Even the SEAL teams, men who rarely respected anyone outside their tight brotherhood, began to treat her as one of their own. Emily felt the weight of this new identity pressed down on her every day, but she carried it with a quiet steadiness, knowing that responsibility was the price of recognition. What she never expected was how much the enemy had begun to study her in return. Intercepts revealed her name whispered in coded transmissions, her contributions referenced indirectly as if she were a ghost figure moving behind every successful mission. That realization both frightened and strengthened her, for it meant she was no longer invisible, but it also meant her enemies now feared her. Hale kept her under closer watch after that, assigning discreet protection even inside the base. Emily resented it at first, hating the shadow of guards that lingered nearby, but the reality struck her when a courier intercepted carrying a message that revealed a plot to abduct her during one of her rare trips into the city. For the first time she felt the walls of her world closing in, her independence threatened by the very role she had embraced. She struggled with the idea that her work endangered others, and late at night she sat in her office staring at the files, wondering if she should step away. But each time she considered it, she remembered the faces of the men she had saved, the silent gestures of gratitude, and most of all, the unwavering look in Hale's eyes when he placed his trust in her. She could not turn away. The stakes were too high. One mission in particular etched itself into her memory. A SEAL unit had been deployed to capture a high-value target in a remote desert outpost, but the operation went silent midway. Panic rippled through the command center, radios buzzing with static. Analysts scrambled with conflicting theories, and the air grew heavy with the dread of another lost team. Hale called Emily in without hesitation. She pored over the last fragments of transmissions, noting something the others had overlooked: faint distortions in the static that repeated like an echo. Using her father's old notes on signal interference, she decoded the pattern, realizing the team had been forced underground into a tunnel system where radios barely penetrated. While others believed the mission was lost, Emily pointed to a hidden entry route only marked on old cartography files. Her certainty carried the room, and Hale ordered a diversion team based on her analysis. Hours later, word came back. The SEALs had been found alive, battered but intact, guided out of the tunnels by the very route Emily had identified. The moment cemented her place in the eyes of the SEALs. That night, one of the rescued men approached her silently in the mess hall, placed his combat knife on the table before her, and walked away without explanation. It was a gesture few civilians would understand, but to the SEALs, it was sacred, a symbol of trust, of life owed. Emily sat staring at the knife for a long time, realizing she had crossed a threshold she could never return from. But victories came with their shadows. The constant weight of responsibility wore at her body and mind. She rarely slept more than a few hours, her dreams filled with fragments of static and coded numbers. The pressure never lifted. Even in moments of quiet, she carried the unspoken fear that one missed detail, one overlooked pattern, could cost lives. Sometimes she would find herself trembling alone in her quarters, staring at her hands as if they no longer belonged to her. Yet she never showed weakness outside those walls. To Hale, to the SEALs, she remained steady, composed, a beacon of clarity when the chaos threatened to overwhelm. It was a mask she wore for them, and it grew heavier each day. Still, when Hale once asked if she needed to step back, she met his gaze with firm resolve and said, "If they trust me with their lives, I can't ask them to carry mine alone." Hale said nothing more, but the respect in his eyes deepened. The day came when she was tested beyond anything she had faced before. A massive joint operation was being planned, one that would require coordination across multiple Allied bases. The enemy had fortified a stronghold believed to house leadership figures who orchestrated the attacks against their forces. The mission's success hinged on predicting enemy movement, but the data was fragmented, full of contradictions. Emily locked herself in with the files for 3 days straight, emerging only for brief meals. She traced patterns across maps, listened to intercepted voices until her ears rang, and studied weather models that could alter terrain mobility. At last, she saw the outline of the enemy's plan, not in the data alone, but in the spaces between it, the gaps where information was conspicuously missing. They were preparing a counterstrike, not a retreat. If the Allied forces marched in as planned, they would walk into a killing field. She presented her findings to the command staff, her voice unwavering as she contradicted nearly every analyst in the room. Tension thickened, senior officers exchanging angry glares. But Hale stood by her, declaring that he would stake the mission on her judgment. Reluctantly, they adjusted the operation according to her plan. When the day came, the ambush she had predicted unfolded exactly as she described, but because the teams were ready, they turned the trap against the enemy, striking a blow that crippled their operations for months. The aftermath was unlike anything Emily had experienced. The base erupted in celebration, the SEALs roaring with victory, their relief washing through the halls like a storm. Amid it all, Hale found her standing quietly at the edge of the command room, exhaustion pulling at her features. He said nothing at first, only raised his hand in another crisp salute, this time not in private but before every officer present. The room fell silent, dozens of eyes turning to her, the civilian who had once been dismissed as nothing more than an assistant. Emily's throat tightened, her heart hammering. She knew she could never return the salute, but she also knew she didn't need to. The acknowledgement was complete, and it bound her to them more deeply than any oath could. She realized then that the journey had transformed her completely. She was no longer the overlooked figure carrying folders in the background. She had become part of the very fabric of the Brotherhood, not through rank or title, but through unshakable trust. And though the road ahead promised more challenges, in that moment Emily Carter stood taller than she ever had, knowing she had carved her place in a world that once tried to keep her invisible. In the weeks following the victory against the enemy stronghold, Emily's life became even more intertwined with the daily pulse of the base. She was no longer summoned only in times of crisis but included in routine briefings, trusted to sift through intelligence before it reached senior desks. The officers who had once resented her presence now kept their silence, for every protest had been crushed by the weight of her proven instincts. Yet their silence was not acceptance. She could feel it in the way some glanced at her when they thought she wasn't looking, the way whispers trailed behind her in corridors. She knew resentment was a shadow she would always carry, but it no longer pierced her as it once did. Respect from the SEALs themselves mattered more than anything else, and it was their acknowledgement that fueled her determination. They treated her as one of their own, even without words, and Emily began to realize how deeply she had become tied to their world. It was no longer a job or even a duty, it was a bond forged in unspoken trust, and the knowledge that lives depended on her clarity. Yet with recognition came heavier burdens. Hale placed in her hands not only intercepted codes but full dossiers, maps and live feeds from missions in progress. She often stood beside him in the command room, both of them silent as green dots on screens moved across hostile terrain. She could read his thoughts in the flicker of his eyes, and sometimes she spoke only a word or two, enough to tip a decision at a critical moment. It was not authority she carried, but influence, the kind born from trust so absolute that no one dared question it aloud. Still, she never forgot that she was not a soldier. She had not endured the brutal training or shed blood in the field. She carried none of their scars. And yet, in another sense, she bore scars just as deep, carved not into her skin but into her mind. Sleepless nights, endless streams of numbers and voices, the crushing fear of missing something small that could mean disaster. These were wounds invisible to others but heavy enough to bend her spirit. It was during this time that Hale called her into his office one evening after most of the base had gone quiet. The lamps cast long shadows across the desk where he sat, his face unreadable. He spoke with a tone she had never heard from him before, softer, almost personal. "You know they look at you differently now," he said. "Not as an outsider. You've earned what few ever could." Emily felt a flush rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond. She admitted quietly that she sometimes feared she was carrying more than she could handle. Hale leaned back, his eyes steady. "Fear is part of it. What matters is that you keep moving through it." There was no flattery in his words, only a raw truth that steadied her heart. For the first time she realized he wasn't just protecting her as a valuable asset. He respected her as an equal in spirit, if not in title. That night as she left his office she carried his words like a shield. But their fragile balance soon faced its harshest test. A mission emerged that shook the base with urgency. Intelligence indicated that a captured Allied officer was being held deep in enemy territory, his knowledge a ticking time bomb if extracted. The SEALs prepared for what many whispered was a suicide mission, and the weight of planning fell heavier than ever. Emily threw herself into the data, tracing every possible extraction route, analyzing terrain, weather, enemy patrols. Hours stretched into days and her body screamed with exhaustion, but she refused to rest. The lives of the team hung in her calculations. At one point Hale found her slumped over maps, barely awake, and placed a firm hand on her shoulder, telling her to breathe, to trust herself. She forced herself back up, driven by the thought of the men walking into the jaws of death, guided only by the precision of her work. At last she found it, a narrow canyon route overlooked in enemy defenses, shielded by natural rock formations. It was dangerous, but it was a thread of hope. She presented it with steady conviction, and Hale built the mission around her plan. The night of the operation, the base was silent except for the constant hum of radios. Emily sat in the command center, her heart pounding with every fragment of transmission. She traced their progress with trembling fingers on the map, whispering silent prayers with each checkpoint crossed. At one point the line went dead, static flooding the room. A cold silence spread, broken only by Hale's calm orders. Emily felt the weight of dread crush her chest, but then the signal crackled back. The team was moving, carrying the officer out, battered but alive. When the helicopters finally returned, she stood on the tarmac with Hale as the SEALs disembarked, the rescued man staggering between them. One of the SEALs, face streaked with grime, caught her eye and gave a nod so deep it carried the weight of everything unspoken. Emily's knees almost buckled with relief. That night the base celebrated in their own restrained way, laughter echoing through halls usually lined with tension. Emily found herself pulled into the circle of warriors, handed a drink, their silent acknowledgement more powerful than any words. She felt for the first time that she truly belonged, not as an outsider looking in, but as part of their brotherhood. Hale watched from the side, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, and Emily knew he had always believed she would reach this moment. Still, she understood something vital. Her journey was not about glory or belonging. It was about carrying a responsibility so heavy it could break her if she faltered. And as she lay awake later, staring at the ceiling, she realized she would carry that weight as long as it was needed, no matter the cost. The weeks leading up to the deployment ceremony passed in a blur of intense training, administrative chaos, and a constant hum of anticipation. For Emily, the work never seemed to end. She was in before most of the men and women of the unit, and usually the last one to leave. The commander had entrusted her with organizing nearly every logistical aspect of the send-off, from arranging the family's seating to ensuring that every piece of equipment and documentation was squared away. On the surface, she appeared calm, moving from one task to the next with focus and efficiency, but inside her heart pounded with the weight of responsibility. This was not just another assignment. This was the defining moment of whether she would continue to be dismissed as just an assistant, or finally earn the respect she had worked so tirelessly for. The days blurred into nights, and sometimes she would fall asleep over her desk with a stack of forms beside her. When she opened her eyes and looked around the dimly lit office, she wondered if anyone truly noticed how much she was giving of herself. But she also knew that she wasn't doing it for recognition anymore. She was doing it because the men of the unit deserved everything to be perfect when they left for deployment. She knew their families needed reassurance, and she knew the commander needed her to succeed. It became less about proving herself and more about doing what she believed was right. On the morning of the ceremony, Emily rose before dawn. The base was quiet, but her mind was racing. She had laid out her uniform the night before, crisp and neat, her shoes polished until they caught the light. As she dressed, she caught her reflection in the mirror and paused. For a moment she saw the tired young woman who had once been brushed aside and laughed at for being just an assistant. But today she saw something else too, a steel in her eyes, a resolve that had been forged through trial and fire. When she stepped out into the cool morning air, the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, and she felt as if the entire base was waking up with her. By the time she reached the parade ground, soldiers were already gathering, their families arriving in clusters, children clinging to their parents' hands, wives and husbands holding back tears. The sight moved her more than she expected. She walked quickly, her clipboard in hand, checking every last detail, ensuring the flags were perfectly positioned, the sound system ready, the seating arranged properly. She didn't allow herself to miss a single thing. As the ceremony began, a hush fell over the crowd. The men stood tall in formation, their uniforms gleaming, their expressions a mixture of pride and solemnity. The commander stepped forward, his voice carrying over the assembled families, speaking words of courage and unity, of sacrifice and honor. Emily stood to the side, watching carefully, ready to step in if anything went wrong, but everything flowed seamlessly, just as she had planned. Then came the moment of the first salute, the symbolic gesture that sealed the bond between the commander and his unit before they departed. Traditionally, this was a moment reserved for a seasoned officer or a decorated soldier, someone who embodied the spirit of the unit. The families leaned forward in anticipation, and even Emily felt her breath catch in her chest, waiting to see who had been chosen. To her astonishment, the commander turned, his eyes searching until they fell on her. He gave a small nod and extended his hand ever so slightly, signaling her to step forward. The murmur of the crowd rose as Emily's feet seemed to freeze in place. For a second, she wondered if she had misunderstood, but the commander's gaze was unwavering. Slowly, almost as if in a dream, she walked forward, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. When she reached him, he stood tall and raised his hand in a crisp, flawless salute, directed at her. Gasps rippled through the audience, and the soldiers shifted in stunned silence. For a long moment, Emily couldn't move. Then, instinctively, she returned the salute, her hand rising with precision, her body locked in perfect alignment. The commander's eyes never left hers, and in that instant she understood what he was saying without a single word. He was telling her that she had earned this. That all the work, all the sacrifices, all the nights spent alone with stacks of papers and endless tasks had not gone unnoticed. He was telling her that she was not just an assistant. She was part of the team, integral to their success, and worthy of the same respect as any soldier on that field. The moment seemed to stretch on forever before the commander lowered his hand, and the rest of the unit erupted in thunderous applause. Families rose to their feet, cheering and clapping, and Emily stood frozen, her cheeks burning, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. She lowered her hands slowly, trying to maintain composure, but inside her chest, something broke open, something she had held back for far too long. She had been seen. She had been acknowledged. After the ceremony ended, families rushed forward to embrace their loved ones, and soldiers exchanged farewells. Emily tried to retreat quietly, but the men of the unit intercepted her, each one stopping to shake her hand, to thank her, to say words of appreciation that left her overwhelmed. One young soldier said softly, "Ma'am, without you, none of this would have happened the way it did. We'll never forget what you did for us." She could barely find her voice to respond. The commander approached last, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "You earned this moment, Emily," he said simply. "And don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The base had gone quieter after the storm of drills and testing days, but Emily knew silence in the Navy was never truly silence. It was the pause before the next wave, the calm before another test of spirit. She spent those evenings polishing reports, checking communication logs, and staying near the command wing, her presence steady though most still viewed her as only an assistant. The SEALs who once mocked her now carried a different expression when she passed them in the corridor, a look not of respect just yet, but of awareness that she was no longer someone they could simply dismiss. She had stepped into the fire during the exercise, and though she hadn't carried a weapon or stormed the field, her quick thinking had shifted the tide. That truth lingered. Yet inside her heart she felt the weight of what she still hadn't proven. Respect earned once could fade if not reinforced. The commander knew it too, which was why, late one night, he called her into his office. He didn't offer a chair at first, just studied her as if deciding whether to reveal what weighed on him. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke of a classified mission on the horizon, a high-risk extraction that required not just the usual strength and discipline but flawless timing and communication. "I don't need someone who can lift 200 pounds or fire a rifle with perfect aim," he said. "I need someone who can think 3 steps ahead when the chaos starts. I think that's you. But you need to decide if you're ready to step into the line with them, because once you do, you can't go back to being just the assistant." His words struck her like a current. This wasn't about filing documents or organizing schedules anymore. He was offering her a place on the edge of battle, where one misstep could mean the difference between life and death. She nodded slowly, the fire in her chest replacing hesitation. "I'll be there," she said firmly, and he gave the smallest approving nod, the kind he rarely showed even his men. Training for her changed after that. She was pulled into night drills, taught the silent codes of hand signals, drilled on operating drones and portable surveillance, and run through scenarios where seconds mattered more than breath. The SEALs who once ignored her now watched closely, some skeptical, some curious, some even quietly supportive. She felt their eyes when she sweated through the late hours, practicing under pressure until her mind and body moved in sync with instinct. She stumbled, she failed, she got back up, and each time her resolve grew sharper. The mission loomed closer. On the day of departure, the team geared up with silent ritual. Rifles checked, armor strapped, blades secured, faces painted with the calm of those who had walked into darkness before. Emily wore lighter gear but carried the critical pack of communications, encrypted systems, and surveillance drones that would keep the team's lifeline alive. No one mocked her now. Not one word of dismissal passed their lips. They understood she was stepping into the fire beside them. The aircraft roared across the ocean night, its inside dimly lit, the vibration thrumming through boots and bones. Emily sat between 2 seasoned SEALs, her hands steady on the case that carried their link to command. Her heart pounded, but not with fear. It was readiness, the raw energy of stepping into a world few civilians ever glimpsed. When the light over the hatch turned red, then green, the SEALs moved as one, leaping into darkness toward the enemy coast. Emily stayed with the commander, descending last, landing with precision as the night swallowed them. The mission unfolded like a storm. Enemy patrols, sudden gunfire, the rush of movement through tangled terrain. Yet through it all, Emily kept her focus. She deployed drones that revealed hidden ambushes, relayed encrypted signals faster than standard protocol, and when a line of communication faltered, she rewired the system under fire, her fingers moving with the calm of someone who knew hesitation could cost lives. At one point, an explosion shook the ground near them, throwing dust and confusion through the trees. A younger seal froze, his path lost in the haze. Emily's voice cut sharp and clear through the comms, guiding him with coordinates until he regrouped with the squad. The commander caught her eye then, a silent acknowledgement that her presence was no accident. Hours later, the extraction target, a captured operative, was secured, but pursuit closed in fast. The team sprinted toward the evacuation zone under fire. Emily ran with them, lungs burning, but refused to let the heavy case slip from her grip. At the clearing, the aircraft descended like a steel hawk, blades tearing the night. The SEALs formed a defensive ring, exchanging fire as Emily scrambled aboard, setting systems to jam enemy signals. Her final act before they lifted off was broadcasting a false trail to mislead their pursuers, a move that bought them the minutes they needed to escape. When the ramp closed and the enemy fire faded into distance, silence filled the cabin, heavy with exhaustion and relief. One by one, the SEALs turned toward her, and though they said nothing, the look in their eyes had changed. She was no longer just the assistant, not a figure in the background. She had been in the storm, carried the weight, and stood unbroken. The commander rose from his seat, walked to her with measured steps, and in front of every hardened man on that aircraft, he gave her a crisp salute. No words needed to follow. That gesture, simple yet profound, was the recognition she had earned not through demand or title, but through grit, resolve, and courage when it mattered most. And in that moment, Emily knew there was no going back. She had become one of them. Jab USS Hall ko andar sab kucher par herani or fakar ka mix dike raha the tab wolarki ek lam kaliya ruk gai, aski sans tez ho.